All right, let's give this a second to go live, and then I want to show you all something really cool. Sweet, looks like it's working. So there's something I've been working on recently, and it's so exciting to me, this particular project, that I really wanted to share it with you all. So it's a batch updater, and this is one of the most frustrating problems that I've had using Vue. And more specifically, the problem is that you have a component, for example, a table, and then you've got a bunch of cells in that table. By the way, if you hear a dog snoring in the background, that's my little Chihuahua Lily. So anyway, you have this problem where you have something like a table, and you don't want the update logic to exist inside of that table, but it's kind of hard to manage that dance between the thing that updates and then the inputs in that table, especially when you're dealing with lots of inputs. So forms are often not that difficult when there's only one form, but if there's multiple forms, then you want to have a spinner. So imagine these are like rows in a table, or even this example here, a whole bunch of cards with forms. And so the problem is we have to create a composable for each of these forms. And that's difficult to do unless you have those composables sitting on the form itself. And that makes, that can often create architectural problems. If you've ever done that before, if you've been, coding for a while, you know how annoying that can be and how that can create frustrating architectural problems. And so what I've done, there's so many other things to this problem. Updating sounds so simple, but doing batch updating, being able to have multiple forms and then keeping them in sync with, what's on the back end. And really, you need your data twice on the front end. You need the data, which is what it looks like right now, kind of like the source of truth. And then you also need the data, which is editable inside of a form. And you need to be able to roll that data back if things go wrong. So there's just so many levels of complexity here. But then the other thing is you want to be able to know what form is updating. And for that reason, that's why, actually there's more problems than that. You also need to be able to know which forms are updating if you're updating multiple forms. So you might be updating this form and this form at the same time, and you want to have a spinner to show both of those forms are updating. And it's not obvious how to do that either. So I've solved this problem in a way where you can swap out the driver, and I wanted to show you what the code ended up looking like for this. So first of all, let's go to the composable. So I've got this use batch updater composable, and I've got a little bit of logic here, which just kind of like manages setting everything up. Basically, reset user data is going to, this is kind of like clearing the database on the front end. So we're using IndexedDB as the database, and then we're populating the database with users, and then we're fetching all of those users so that they end up in our store. So if I refresh the page here, and I jump into Vue, actually I should be able to use the new Vue dev tools now. Let's see if this works. Yeah, okay, Pina isn't working. I'm not going to go into why it's not working, but it's basically because I need to have two stores in order to work, in order to use this plugin. So that fetches all the users, and we've got logic here to make the form. So this is the important part. All we have to do to make the form is call make forms. And that basically just finds all the users in the store and automatically creates forms for all of those users. So now if I call make form, that goes ahead and runs that. I might even do a split here, just to make it a bit easier to see. Let's just close that out and close that out, just to simplify things a bit. Okay, so here's the cool part though. So the user's batch updater, right, we're using this composable here, and I just wrap it in reactive, which means I don't have to say .value all the time. That's a cool little trick. If I come down to the user's batch updater, in order to update, all we have to do is when you click on this button is call that update function. And straight away, that's going to figure out what's changed in all of the forms and send a batch update request to the backend. And like I said before, the implementation I'm using at the moment, so you can swap out the driver for this, and the implementation I'm using at the moment is using IndexedDB. So that's kind of like local storage, but it's a little bit more advanced. And you can see here are my user records, and this is kind of acting as my backend. This is great for prototyping because it basically means that the user's computer is the backend. So you can easily change up your models. In order to change a model, all I have to do is change my user model, and then just clear everything inside of my key value store here, and then that's just going to work. So this is a really, really cool way to develop, and it means that I don't need a real backend. Okay, so let's come back over here. And this is the magic part. So the batch updater has got forms available, right? If I do a dot here, by the way, everything is fully typed, and we can just access the forms. But I've introduced this other concept, which is shaped forms. And shaped forms, and I'm probably going to rename this. I can't think of a good name for now. It's just temporary. But this gives you your form, but then a bunch of information, useful information about that form as well. So you get the ID of that form, because forms don't have the ID in it, because that can cause problems when you're doing an update. Usually you don't want the ID to exist in a form, so I often like to keep them separate. So you got the form, you got the ID. You also get a list of all of the fields and information about those fields. So I'll give you an example here. We can say fields dot, and that gives us a list of all of our fields. And I could say dot name dot, and now we can see if that field has changed, what the initial value is of it, or whether or not that particular field is currently updating. So when you do an update, if only the name field is updating, you can now easily have a spinner that only shows for the name field. So for example, let's just say we do an update and I change the name here, the email there, and the email over here. Then we can have spinners that show here, here, and here. That is usually really frustrating to build. That's a really difficult problem to solve, and this Composable handles all of that logic for you. So that's essentially what's happening here. In order to know if it's updating, we just say, give me the fields, and the input specifically here is for the name, and let me know whether or not it's updating. And another thing we have is whether or not it's changed. So I'm just adding a bit of a border on the left to show me if that field has changed. So if I type in here, that little orange border on the left shows me that it's changed. But if I get rid of a few of those characters, it automatically figures out that that field is no longer being changed. Really, really cool. Super annoying stuff to build, and I've built it in a way that is, at least to the best of my abilities, quite efficient as well. So rather than having computers that are re-evaluating for every single one of these forms, I've basically put in the extra work to make sure that we can track changes as you type into this form. So the other thing we can see is whether or not the entire form has changed. So changed and updating, that lets us know if that entire form has changed or if that entire form is updating. And you can see here we say, hey, has the form changed? If it has, make the background orange, otherwise just use the initial color there. And that's why when we type into these forms, you can see those changes that are showing up. Now, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into my instantiation of this plugin. And I've added a little feature here where we can add a mock latency. So let's add a mock latency of maybe 700 milliseconds. So I'll save that, come back into making these forms here, put in a bit of text there, a bit of text here, and a bit of text there. And now when I press update, we'll be able to see here that it's updating. So that's the code there. If it's updating, it shows the word updating on the title of that form. The labels are also going to show you, so it's only going to show updating next to the label that is actually updating. So this one won't show updating, and this one will. So it's able to be specific to that form. And yeah, that's what I want to show here. So let's click on update. And it was a little bit hard to see because it went really quickly. Let's add a ridiculous delay, maybe like 8,000 milliseconds. So that'll be 8 seconds. And that adds the delay to making the form as well. So if I click on make form, that's going to take 8 seconds for that form to make. And if we wanted, we could also have a spinner for that as well. So we could say, for example, this will be easy to do. Batch, what is it? It's called users batch updater dot making forms. So if that's set to true, then we'll say making, and then I'll just do an empty string otherwise. We can do dot, dot, dot there. Oh, not make forms, that should be making forms. Oh, maybe I haven't implemented that yet. Okay, looks like I haven't. That's all right, I can add that later on. That's fine for now. Now I've got to wait 8 seconds again for that to show. But if we just give that a hot second, I mean, I'm sure you believe me anyway, but I wanted to show you guys this. So we'll add some changes to the names for those and then the emails for these. And then we go update, and we can see the names are updating, emails updating there, name there, email there, etc. And then it goes back when it's all done. So how cool is that? A really, really easy way to basically model things when you're doing a batch update. And this also means rather than sending a whole bunch of update requests, often backends have the ability to do batch updates. So now, for example, I use Laravel Orion for my backend, but if I'm using Supabase, Laravel Orion, Strapi, or a lot of these backends offer batch updating built in. So now, let me show you the part where we have to actually implement it. So we got use batch update. I thought that's what it was. It's not, no. Oh, sorry, not use. Batch update, because behind the scenes it uses a batch update function. So basically all you have to do is implement this contract in order to get all the functionality I've just shown you here. And by the way, we've got other stuff like validation errors and standard errors as well. So if I go to response here, I can give you an example of an update with a standard error and then an update with a validation error. So we can see for the form with an ID of 1, the field name has got these errors. So you can really, really easily hook into errors as well. Okay, so that's that part. And yeah, so basically all you have to do is implement this contract, and the signal and throw part is optional. So if you want it to be throwable, you've got the, if you want to be able to abort your function, you can actually do that by sending through a signal. And you know that'll work too. So yeah, all it does is accepts a model, and this is a Pina ORM model. I won't go into what that is, but Pina ORM basically allows you to create. It allows you to insert, update, delete, etc. Models on the front end. So it's basically managing an ORM store on the front end. So that's what we use here. And it accepts all of the forms and any options you might have as well. And then for the response, we basically say exactly what we expect the response to look like. And I'll give you an idea of a successful response here. Oh, I've got it set to 8 seconds. So let's go back into here and bring it back down to 700 milliseconds. Yeah, and then you would have the records inside of an array there, the name of the action. Oh, there we go. Whether or not it was successful. I didn't get those records back there. I think I might have built something wrong here in this example. Anyway, I have to go dig back into those examples and see what I've done wrong. But yeah, so that's all you have to implement. And I'll give you an example of one of these. So if we say, for example, update, I'll show you what it looks like for Laravel Orion. Update.ts for the Orion driver. Here we go. So this is an example of the code that you would have to write. And honestly, a lot of this is copy-pastable. So you could probably just copy this and sort of rejig it in order to suit your needs. There's a bit of stuff here around getting the config. That's all stuff that could just be, copy-pasted. Getting the driver key, because this supports multiple drivers. So you might have 2 backends, and you can use both of them at the same time. And this is just dealing with the abort signal. You don't have to implement that code if you don't want to. So again, this is working with the abort signal. Notifying when there's errors. I don't think you actually need that code anymore. I've figured out how to sort of put that further up the chain to make it easier for implementers. But this is the crux of it here. Basically, I use Retch in order to do my request. You can use whatever you want. You can use Axios here. And you just figure out how to hit the backend. So you get the entity name to figure out what the backend URL is, and then the ID of that entity, send through the form, and then convert it to JSON. And it's pretty much as simple as that. And then depending on your backend, you might need to do some shaping here in order to get that response looking how it needs to look. So for example, maybe your backend gives you key value pairs for your data. So maybe it's like keyed by ID, in which case you would have to do something like an object.values here. But almost all APIs, in fact, I'm pretty sure all APIs I've ever used just give you an array back as a response, because often they need to have the ability to be able to be ordered, which is why that needs to be an array. So that's pretty much it. And then you just need to write the code for handling errors as well, standard errors and validation errors. And then once you've written all of that, it takes a bit of time to write up front, but then you get the benefit of all of these composables. And I've already done this for Laravel Orion, so that means I can release this driver, and anybody who uses this can now get it working with Laravel Orion. And I'm committing to writing all of the implementations for IndexedDB as well. So even if you just want to use this stuff for prototyping, you can then do prototyping really, really quickly, and then maybe you could then just swap this code out for something else that you want to use, if you have your own way of writing backend code. So yeah, I just wanted to give you guys a bit of an idea of what this looks like. And I'm pretty sure there's a site I've got for this. The documentations is decent. It's not fully up to date. But if you go to viewmodel.github.io/core, yeah, I got some documentation here that shows you that'll give you an idea of its current state. So what's particularly interesting, I think, is the indexer. So the indexer has got, all sorts of functionality for filtering, including relationships and even deeply nested relationships. And the way it works is kind of cool. So I thought a lot about the API for this. I've written out an API similar to this many, many times, and made heaps and heaps of mistakes. And I've decided on an API that I think works really well, which is very object-based. So rather than providing filters in an array, for example, we use objects instead. And that allows me to create things that are very, very well typed, especially when you're using deeply nested relationships. So I find an example, deeply nested with, here's an example here. And you'll notice that it's very object-based syntax. So if you're used to something like, you can also use string syntax as well. So if you want, you can actually write code like this, but the typing isn't going to be as good. Whereas if we use object-based syntax, then we can also very easily do some pretty interesting stuff with filtered nesting as well. And I think there's an example here. Yeah, here's an example of some filtered nesting with an OR block. You could say, get me my posts with posts. Actually, that example doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? You wouldn't get posts with posts. Maybe I can look at one of these examples. Yeah, so get me my user, filter it by the name, where the name is equal to that. So I think this reads really nicely. Get it with my posts, and then you can do deeply nested filtering as well. We can even go like more layers deep. Get me my users with the posts, and with those posts I want the comments, and I want those comments ordered by commented on descending. So you can do some pretty cool stuff with deeply nested filtering as well. And again, the idea is I want to be able to create multiple drivers for these different backends as well. And I've got a few other things like hooks and, so on success and errors. We got global hooks, but we've also got hooks for individual composables as well. So I don't know if I've documented this. Looks like I might not have. Have we got like an on success here? No, so all of these have hooks as well. And then we've also got actions. So actions is basically what's used behind the scenes for all of the composables. So we've got the index action, and this is essentially what the developer would implement in order to get these drivers to work. So the new one I'm adding now is batch updater. So you would have a batch updater action, and essentially the action is just being able to do those requests without the composable. So there are some situations where you need to just use the action directly, so we expose the actions as well. So here's an example of that, where you can just say index, a user, and because it's receiving that user class, everything gets fully typed, which I think is super nice. Yeah, it does look like GraphQL. Especially this kind of objecty type syntax here. And in fact, there's no reason that you couldn't use GraphQL as an implementation for this. So all of this stuff could totally work with GraphQL. GraphQL's got a way where you can use, I think, a star symbol to say, get me all of the fields. So you could actually use that concept to get GraphQL working with Vue model. But then, in my opinion, this is a lot, especially if you're working with Vue, this works a lot better than just raw GraphQL. Because if you're using raw GraphQL, you wouldn't get a lot of the benefits that I'm able to give you through these composables. So essentially, I'm saying here inside of the actions, these are the contracts you need to follow. So if you're doing an update, this is what needs to go in and this is what needs to come out. And if you follow that contract, then there is heaps of Vue-related functionality that I can give you. And so that, like, there are some rules you need to follow with coding this way, but if you follow those rules, then you get some ridiculous benefits from these composables. Honestly, writing with these composables is so much easier than doing all of this stuff from scratch. And every company I've ever worked at, literally every single one of them, has not had a simple way of working with backend data. They often write their own stores where you have to do manual stuff, and they often, in fact, every single one I've worked at hasn't had a way. And granted, I've worked at a lot of startup related, kind of companies, or sort of coming out of startup companies, but they've never had a way of just working with the back end. They've never had sort of a contract. But if you do it this way, if you and you don't have to use my way of doing it. This is just my solution to this problem. But if you have composables like this, where you can say, for example, const user updater is equal to use updater, and then you pass in whatever you use to sort of shape your user, and then you can have stuff like on success, where you've got a callback there. And then for the form, you can then say user updater dot form dot name, so you can easily model the form. And then to update it, you can say user updater dot update. Like these APIs are not that hard to write, and chances are you're going to write this kind of code anyway. And so I just figured, I've written this code so many times for my own projects and for projects for other people that I've worked with, that I wanted to just sort of standardize a lot of the lessons I've learned, which is what Vue model is. So it's a lot of, this is very, very opinionated. So a lot of this kind of stuff that you see on the web is not very opinionated. And there's pros and cons to that. It means you have to write more of the code yourself. But since I've taken on a lot of the opinions, since I've added a lot of the opinions and said, for example, okay, this is how we're doing filtering. It has to be shaped the way I want it to be shaped, right? I've already decided on the API. You don't get to choose the API for this. That's the trade-off, right? You're basically subscribing to my contracts here and my way of developing things. And this is kind of like what Laravel does. It's yet to be seen whether or not people will like my API as much as they do Laravel. But this is the idea where if somebody can make more decisions for you, then there is a huge number of benefits that come along with that. And that's kind of what I'm trying to build here. I'm trying to make the best decisions I can around these composables so that everybody else can benefit from it. And that's why you end up with APIs like this. And I honestly think this code is some of the best code I've ever written. Stuff like this, where it'll look a lot neater when I write it with Quasar. But this is the key here. Inside of the for loop, we have all of those forms already shaped for us. And we can basically iterate over all of them. We can pull out the ID so that we can easily put the key in there. You've probably written code like this many times in your life, where you have a for loop with lots of forms. I can pluck the form out. I can see the field. You can see here, I can see whether or not it's changed, updating what the initial value is for each of those individual fields. I can see whether or not that whole form has changed. I can see whether or not that form is updating. And now we can just easily pull all of that out and just start working with the data. This stuff is hard to write, at least in my experience. It's hard, and it takes a lot of time to do it well, and it's easy to make a lot of mistakes. Maybe it's not actually that hard to write, If you've been doing composables for a long time, you've probably written something like this yourself. But getting an API right and adding the typing as well, the typing is really difficult to do. But if I can just take that on and get that typing correct myself, and then allow all of you to basically just benefit from that, I think that would be super, super cool. So yeah, I just wanted to share that with you. I think this is super awesome. I can't wait to start doing videos using some of these composables. The reason I've been holding off it is because the batch updater is such an important composable. You really can't get very far, at least in my experience, you can't get very far without it because, having to show multiple forms is such a fundamental thing in a lot of the apps that I build. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this one. I'll see you in a future live stream where hopefully soon we'll actually start building some stuff with all of these tools. And by the way, I'm going to be at vue.conf.de. I think it's Vue. Let me just find the website for this because I want to be able to. I'm hoping that a lot of you can sort of show up there. It's vue.js.de, but there's an English version as well. Here we go, conf.vue.js.de. I'm going to be talking at this conference and doing a workshop using some of the tooling that I talked about here with Quasar. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, then it would be so cool to see some more Quasar developers at this conference. But honestly, any Vue developers, I'm super excited to meet you all. Looks like tickets are still available, so yeah, come along. And just got a comment here that works with multiple. So, okay, good question. There is a couple of things you would have to do differently with child forms. So currently, this doesn't work like GraphQL. I've been thinking a lot about this and I still can't think of a nice way that I can do it. This isn't like GraphQL where you can basically do one request that does nested updates for a form as well. So what you would essentially have to do is, let me just do some dummy code to explore what this might look like. So let's just say the user has got a lot of posts and you want to be able to edit those. Not a realistic example, but we can do that here. So maybe you do something like this. v-for post in, and then you would have your post keyed by the user ID. So, or maybe like your post forms keyed by the user ID. So post forms keyed by user ID, something like that. And this would, or maybe not even keyed actually, maybe grouped. Yeah, that would make sense. So if you group all of your posts by the user ID, and then the post, this would essentially be pulling off of something that's using the batch updater as well. Then from this point, you could essentially take a lot of the same concept here. So that's a good question, actually. How would I build this? And then the cool thing is once I figure out how I would solve this problem, I can then build composables to make it a lot easier. So then we could say that inside of post forms grouped by user ID, and that would essentially use the shaped forms behind the scenes. And then we would pass through here the current ID. And then we could say, for example, input, and then we could just do a view model there. And then all of this would be typed, obviously. So this is a computer. This would probably be a computer that I'd build that automatically groups those post forms. So it wouldn't be too hard to do this. And then once you've figured out the concept, you could then create a composable that would look something like this. And eventually I could pull that into core, where you could say like const post forms grouped by user ID is equal to, and then you would have, for example, a post batch updater. Okay, this is fun actually. This is an interesting problem. And then maybe you'd have a computer there. I'd have to think about the best way to do this. And I know Lodash has a group by, but you could do whatever use whatever you want for your group by there. And then, yeah, okay. So then you would say post batch updater dot shaped forms dot value. So you take those shaped forms. I don't need dot value because I used reactive there. And then you could do something like this. You could say form dot user underscore ID, or maybe you'd actually have to find that form because the user ID wouldn't exist on it because it's a related field. Or would it exist? No, it would. There's no reason that wouldn't exist in the field. Oh, but form would have to be plucked out of there. So I wonder why that's not working. Post batch updater. Oh, probably because group by doesn't actually exist. But this is basically pseudo-ish code anyway. But then you do something like that. So now you've got posts that are grouped by the user ID. So you can easily find all of the posts for that user ID. And then we can come down here. And then, you could then use that. I don't know, maybe there. In order to essentially do the same concept here, but now with all of the post forms, and then you would just pass through the ID like that. So that's one way that you could do it, and that's not too difficult. That's something you can whip up pretty quickly. But then, that's a great question, actually. This has got me thinking now. So what if we could do something like this? I'm just going to redo this down here. What if we could then say, includes or something like that, or widths. And then I could say, give me that with my post forms. And then maybe you can allow filtering as well. And this uses the filters on the indexer. And then the result of that, so in fact, let me just paste that in here. Then what would this look like? We could then say like dot shaped forms dot for each form. But remember, that's not actually the form. That gives you the form and a whole bunch of other fields. So maybe inside of there you could then have like related forms. Yeah, holy crap, this would be so cool. You could then, okay, so related forms like that. I just don't know how I would type this, so this could be very difficult to type. But then you could say related forms dot posts. That would have to be post plural. Okay, so that would mean inside of this for loop, this is what the code would actually end up looking like. You'd have a div inside of there, and some sort of bordering or something to separate that. But then we could say v-for is equal to, and we would pluck out of here related forms, or with forms, it doesn't matter what that's called for now. And then we could say here, the exact same concept where we're plucking all of these out. You know what, let's just put this all in one line. I think that was a bad idea, doing it like that. Yeah, okay, so let's copy that concept and then paste it in here. And in this case, we could say users batch updater shaped forms dot related forms dot post. No. The related forms we've already pulled out of here. I just confused myself. So all you would have to do is say related forms dot posts, and now, yeah, that would be it, and this would work. Dude, thank you so much for giving me this sort of brainwave. This is a great idea. And now you can put the ID in there like that. And now you can really, look, how good is this? Now we can really easily do nested forms as well. And we could even do something like this. Maybe we force the word form at the end of that. No, that would kind of mess with the typing. Oh, maybe not actually. I think there's a way you can use, with TypeScript, you can kind of append a string to a type. So what we could do is, instead of calling this related forms, we could do some magic to make it basically say posts forms. So now we can pluck post forms out of there to make this even more succinct. Now that is cool, and this is something that you could do nested as well. So then maybe the posts have got authors, so you could then say authors forms, and this would need to be pluralized. You couldn't say author singular forms, because we would have to use TypeScript to essentially figure out what that string is and then append the word forms with a capital F on the end there. But then we could do something like this, where you've got an input there. Man, I wonder if I should implement this now. Not now as in live. But then you can have an input here and then say vModel is equal to form dot, and this I could see it in my head. We could figure out how to type this. We could definitely get that typed. Form dot, this is a post form, so title. I wonder if we could actually, use that string concept here and call this user form. No, we can't, because there's no user singular. There's no way we could figure out the typing for the name of that. Users. You could call it users form. No, we'll just leave that for now. Interesting concept though. But now inside of here, we can use form.title on that, and then we could go even deeper, and the API is still beautiful. So now we could do this. In this case, it would be authors forms, and imagining that we're finishing at this point. I wonder if you would end up with some like reactivity issues here, or, well, not reactivity issues, but whether or not this could remain performant if you're doing this kind of nesting at this point. And look, honestly, you probably make new components at this point, but even if you're making new components, that doesn't actually change this concept here. And then you could have an input for the author as well. And then you would say, for example, v-model, and you still have all that functionality from before. So we have the author's name, but we can still do cool stuff like this, where we can say, for example, if we want to know that specific field is updating, even though we've nested it 3 levels deep, we would still have a way to be able to say form dot No. You'd have to know the field. So you just do fields dot name dot updating, and that would also still work. So you could see whether or not it's updating, and then you could just say like updating, and then otherwise you could just say like name. I don't know, something like that. So yeah, this is a really cool idea. Okay, you know what? I'm gonna have to have a little quick look at how I might stub this out. So here's my use updater interface. And so you would have an option here called width. So that would be, so for the use updater options, we would say width, but it needs to have this kind of nested with style syntax, which is really, really difficult to build, or at least it was for me. I made this like composable indexer widths. Yeah, and I could probably figure out how to do it there. But anyway, so I know I can do this, but you would just have to have like widths that then gives you that nesting. But let's have a look at the other side of it as well. in that shaped data, if we come back into my use batch updater, actually no, I think we can find it in here. Maybe it was a capital S. Oh, I'm in the wrong file. Use batch updater, my bad. Here we go, shaped forms. So inside of here, we would then have something like this. But how do I figure out the names here? So then I would also have to do fancy typing to say, all of these would have to be optional. So you'd have to do optional chaining here, because I don't think there's a way that I could easily. Oh, maybe I could. Yeah, it would be very difficult to essentially take the types from what's passed in there and then figure out how to then add the typing of posts form there. So you'd have to make all of these optional, so that this could be, for example, posts form, and I'd have to get all of those field types from that. All right, so I'm not going to stub it out right now because this is going to take a long time to figure out all the typing for it. But that would be really cool, and I don't think it would even be that hard to build. So the only effort that you really have to do is the shaped forms. So inside of the use batch updated driver, use batch, yeah, so inside of the driver here, we've got the code. So that's what makes the shaped forms. Essentially, I'd have to be able to do something here where we say, maybe we can stub it out. So you'd have, for example, options dot related forms or something like that. What did we call it here? No, we just called it width. Options.width, you'd have to do like an object dot entries on that, and then like a for each, and then so then we'd be able to say like width field is equal to entry 0, and at least for now that's all we would really need. And then, so I'd also need to make repos for all of these so that I can find that data. So you'd also have to do like with repos here is equal to you probably do like an object.values. Yeah, and essentially you'd have to recursively figure out how to find all of your width repos. So you'd have to kind of like normalize this in order to find out all of the related repos that you need to work with. So then you'd have to do like object.values options.width. Let's just imagine we're doing this shallow. We'll just do a map for now. And this would be the width, or width field. And then what we'd have to do, and I know you can do this with Pina ORM, is we'd have to discover that relationship. So I'd have to go like repo, because I actually did it. I've got this earlier in here where we create the repo. So there's a way I would be able to use that repo to then find the relationship. It's like, or maybe even the model class, because that gets passed through as well. Yeah, I don't know. I've written code somewhere that does this. So let's just like do some pseudocode for this. You then say like get related class. So I'd figure out how to do that with the width field. And then I could say const related class is equal to that, or something like that. And then we could say return use repo, and then send through the related class, and that's it. But then you would want to do this in a way that you can map it. So maybe like something like object.entries, and this concept's really breaking down now, but I'm just kind of like doing some pseudocode here, where you would then say, the width field is equal to that class, which means you would end up with something like this. Posts is equal to, is that the example we use? Yeah, post is equal to whatever that post repo is. So the post repo. So now that I've got that, we would then be able to go through each of these forms. And let's just imagine we're going one level deep. And I could say, for example, const related forms is equal to an object there. And then you'd say related forms, and then you'd say the name of that width field. You'd actually have to do some extra digging here, because sometimes that width field name is not going to match up with posts. For example, that could be recent posts. So I would have to do extra digging, but it's I'm just going to like pseudo do this for now. Imagine that that's not a problem. So you could say related forms, width field. That only gives you the repo though. You actually need an entire batch updater for this. So instead of doing use repo, I would have to actually do an entire use batch updater. And I can probably just use this current function. So I don't actually know how that would work. I think it would work. And then we could have for here post batch updater. And now we can come in here and say post with batch updater. Oh no, so at this point you'd be adding it to the form. So the form, so that's now given me that batch updater that we're currently on. And now I need to be able to, come on, brain. And now we can say, yeah, okay, then we can use the width field ID in order to set that. So now we've got that related form in there, but we just need to add the word form on the end. So we would then maybe just do plus form. So for example, that would read post form there. So now we've got this related forms that could look something like this. Post form is equal to, and then that would be, for example, the post batch updater. Okay, so that would now be built up correctly, and we can just use the spread operator here, and we know that it's not going to clash with anything because it's got the word form on the end. So I know that anything with the word form on the end isn't going to clash with anything inside of my metadata or any of these fields or any of these other fields. So that would be it. This is totally doable. So the typing is going to be hard, but I've already solved all the hard typing problems in the past anyway. So then if we built something like this, we could totally do it and then use that API. Oh, but that's just the batch updater. So you actually need to go deeper and say not just the batch updater. You would have to do you'd have to do the grouping as well. So you'd have to say, for example, const forms is equal to, and this is where you get your group by, and I wouldn't pull it from Lodash because I don't want to depend on that. So I'd find a group by that's kind of on its own, or write my own, or use one that I find on the web. And then, you would then also need to figure out the ID from Pina ORM, and we would say, get all of the forms out of that, because remember, this is its own batch updater, dot forms, dot value, and then I would just need to figure out how to find out what the ID is in relation to this current form. So you would be like, I don't know, like get um, related ID from form, and I don't know, something like that. And then you would just have to pass through model class, and then yeah, I'd have to figure out how to do that. That's going to be complicated. But then you basically figure out how to do that so that you get the forms grouped. But this would actually sit outside of that entries loop, because once you've done the grouping, you can then just use it for each one. It would actually would sit outside of there as well. It would probably sit in its own computer now that I think about it. But now that we've got, yeah, okay, so all of this, oh man, all of that would sit outside of there. Okay, so let's get rid of all of this logic and just look at what we want to end up with. So we would want to end up with forms where maybe you've got like a path to that form. So, well, let's call this related forms. So for example, maybe you use dot notation for the path there, and it might be, for example, posts. Or you would just nest it inside of the form itself. Yeah, I probably would do that. So maybe it would look something like this. Then you would say batch updater, and that would be equal to the post batch updater. So this is what I'd have to figure out how to build, this related forms object. But so we're stubbing it out for now. And then you would also have to know what its relateds are. So maybe you call this like relateds. And then inside of that, that would have, for example, authors. And then it would also have its own relateds. In this case, that would be empty because it's with the example we created before, that would be the end of it. And then it would have a batch updater, which would be the authors batch updater. But then you also need the forms grouped at this point as well. So then you would have, for example, forms grouped by ID, or whatever you want to call that. And that would be, for example, so it would use this batch updater to find its forms. And that would be, for example, so posts, the ID of the post. No. It would be the ID of the current thing we're on. So I don't even know what would. Yeah, this would be a user. So it would be like the ID of the user. So like some user ID, just to make that clear. And then that would be equal to all of the forms. Yeah, okay, so that would then be equal to all of the forms. But in this case, the forms would actually be one of these, right? So let's call this, this would basically be equal to its own shaped forms. So I could put that in there so I know what that means. Okay, so now that's got its forms grouped by the ID of this thing. And now this would also have forms grouped by ID, but this one would be then some post ID, right? So this would be the ID of a post. And now that I've got those grouped forms, I would then have a way to come in here you know what? Maybe when you call this composable with, maybe it calls with whatever depth it's got left. So for example, the post batch updater, when it gets created, gets called with a width that's equal to authors, right? So it's basically just been like normalized. Well, not normally, sorry, like extracted from the width that it received, and then this would get its own width, and it would be nothing at this point because there's no more widths required, because that's kind of the end of the nesting. So then that makes this part easier as well, because then when we do related forms here, in order to find that, I can do this. This is not that hard. I'm nearly there. Related forms would equal we've already used the word related forms, so maybe we just call this like all related forms. But so you don't have to, I wouldn't have to nest this anymore, because since this gets called with its nesting, then authors automatically get set up with its correct nesting, at that point. So that problem is now solved, and that simplifies this concept. So rather than having to write all of this, we just rely on the composable to do it by sending width through. So now we can say, oh man, this super simplifies things. All related forms, and then we send through the ID of the current, in this case it would be a user, so the ID of the current user we're on, and that's it. Oh, and then dot, no, that's not quite it. Dot, it would actually be forms grouped by ID, and then we would send through the ID of the form we're currently on. Chances are I'm going to need a whole bunch of question mark dots along the way, and then I can basically just coerce this to an empty object just to keep things safe when I'm building this for the first time. What errors am I getting here? Okay, so I've done something, looks like I've done something wrong in there. That closes there. Okay, because that's no longer necessary. I just didn't close all of that out correctly. Yeah, and I can just comment this out, and I'll comment this out just so they're there for when I implement it. And that's actually it. All related forms. No, it's not. I got close though. You'd have to do something like this. Const related forms, you'd have to do like an object up front, and then build it out, or however I decide to do this in the end. Maybe we can just do an entries in here and just see what we end up with. This probably isn't the best way to write it, but I'm just trying to get something out there for now. So that would be the width field, the name of the width field, and then like width details or something like that. Doesn't matter what I call it. And now this is where you can then just do like an object dot from entries. Oh god, I'm sure I could write this better. It's fine. Nobody cares. Yeah, that's probably easier. And give myself some space so I can see it better. And instead of a for each, we make this a map. Oh man, what a mess I've made. So now I need, this is where I need those forms where the key is equal to the name of the width field. Okay, so we can do that first. Plus the word form, plus form. And then we want the form itself. No, we don't want the form itself. We want the entire batch updater shaped. So this is where you would then say with details, because now we're in this object here, dot batch updater, and then we get its shaped data or shaped forms, whatever it's called. And there we go. That's it. I think that's pretty much it. So then that gets passed through there. Okay, let's quickly look at this. So, by the way, I think I can make this better. Um, I just kind of needed the pseudocode there, but that would then we would then call this shaped forms just to make it more obvious what we're dealing with. Shape forms. Would I can use dot value at this point, can't I? Yeah. So you would do that, and then this would have the shape. We don't need dot value anymore at this point, and it would just be shaped forms. Yeah, I just wanted to clean that up a little bit, make it more realistic of how I'll write it when I implement it. Okay, so we basically create this array of all the related forms, and now I can create those related forms, but that's creating an object from entries. That's not what we want. What we actually want is an array of that. So that gives you the width field. Yeah, we actually all we want is the shaped forms here. We just want an array of that. So that'll super simplify things. Okay, so those are the entries. I've got to wrap my head around this again now. So that's the width field, so that would be that. Width details, that shaped form. Yeah, all right, that's it. So there's a few finicky things I'll need to do to implement this to figure out, what the code is for that. But that's pretty much it, and we can achieve nested forms. And then, of course, let me just think through this in my head. Would this be performant? I don't see why it wouldn't be performant. I'm just worried that shaped forms, yeah, this computed is now going to get triggered. I don't know if there's an easier way to do this, though. There might be a way I can use object pointers to avoid having to re-trigger this entire computed. But as kind of a proof of concept, I think this is totally fine. So the problem I'm thinking of is if one of these nested form values changes. So if I change a value in author, then this entire computed is going to run again. And now we have to get all related forms. So I'd want to see if I can pull that out of computed. In fact, I don't see why I couldn't. Well, let's think about this. You'd have to get rid of dot value there, I think. And then put it in here. So we can also just think about making this computed more efficient. Forms grouped by ID. Yeah, okay, then that would be a reference to those particular shaped forms. Yeah, so that'll point to the reactive. So that would work correctly. I can put that outside of there and that would still work. Okay. So let's see if we can extract anything else out here. Where does that ID get used? So what we might be able to do is make related forms a ref. It might not even need to be a ref. You know what? It actually doesn't need to be a ref. It just needs to be an object because we already know up front. The only problem would be, yeah. So the only problem would be if you wanted to make this dynamic. So if you wanted an API that could work like this as well, yeah, you might actually want to do that. I mean, at this point, you could just say, look, if you want to do something like that, refresh the entire component. Maybe, I don't know. But so this is the problem. If we want that to be reactive, I can't know what this is going to be up front, and then I need to do some sort of work to reevaluate it. Maybe you just do that. Maybe you just do the work. So maybe you have a watcher on your width. You run it the first time, so you have an immediate on that watcher, and then every time width changes, you have to reevaluate your forms and then all of the nesting for those forms. And I could probably do some smart things to see which ones already exist. And if it already exists, then just leave it. But if any form nested within there doesn't, yeah, you know what? You could totally do this. This is totally doable. That is totally doable. So in order to do that, you would then have this related forms object. It actually doesn't have to be a ref at this point. And essentially, you would just have to have a function that reevaluates this, that you can call to reevaluate this whenever that value changes. So we already have all the related forms. So what would we be missing here? Actually, this code wasn't doing much anyway, was it? It's just grabbing all the entries from that, which is going to be a very small array anyway. Okay, yeah, I was thinking of the wrong problem, really. So it's okay to keep that in there. That's not where we're going to lose performance. Where we're going to lose performance is here when we're calling the all related forms. Yeah, but honestly, that's not even going to be that slow. It would, yeah, your most of your performance problems are probably going to sit here within the width repos. Just think about this. Get rid of. Yeah, because that's where you have to create the batch updaters. Oh, that's going to be a problem. So if you then update this computed, you have to create another batch updater, and you can't do that because script setup has to be able to run straight away. Yeah, so this simply isn't going to be possible. At least not in a V1. It's probably unrealistic to want to be able to do that in a V1. Because I'd have to completely, fundamentally change the way the updater works or do some sort of like crazy manual stuff to get batch updating to. Yeah, nah, not going to happen. Okay, so, all right, I'm going to leave that for now and yeah, maybe try and actually build this thing out. So let me just run through it one more time in my head. When we pass through width, we then create repos for all of those widths. We don't actually do it for all of them. We only do it for the first level. So in this case, I would create a repo for posts. But if I had something else inside of there, we would also create a repo for that. And when I say a repo, that's probably not a good word. With batch updaters, something like that. Or maybe nested batch updaters. No, I think with is a better word. I don't know, I can think that through. So now we've got this batch updater here, and they're all keyed. So then we can come down here and we can get all of our related forms. And in order to do that, this I haven't written the code for. This is kind of like pseudo of what it'll end up being like. We get the shaped forms, and for whatever that field is, and give it the shaped forms. So why are we doing that twice? Hang on, this doesn't make sense. You got the you only need the shaped forms grouped by ID. It's not necessary. Why did I do this? Was there any reason? No, that doesn't make sense. This then needs to use the ID to get the correct shaped forms. So we can actually do this. We can just give that, we don't need any other details inside of there. So all related forms. Forms grouped by ID. So now we've got all of the shaped forms. We don't need an object.entries. So now we can just return the form. This gets way simpler. Shaped forms. Yeah, because I've basically plucked out the group here when I said ID. So now I can just return that shaped form. This gets even simpler. And we've got the related forms we can send through there. So now the only hard part, aside from typing, because typing is going to be a little bit of an effort, but the only hard part is figuring out how to create this variable here and figuring out how to create this batch updater here. Yeah. And then, yeah, because this variable, I have to write some sort of code to, actually that code will be easy to write. I'll be able to just say, give me my current widths, and then use the ID of whatever the current thing is in order to get the right width object there. Yeah, so that'll be easy to write. Cool. Well, yeah, I think this is pretty good to go. That's all the pseudocode. So now that we've thought, by the way, this is a great example of where I think it just makes more sense to think through the API first. Think through exactly what you want to build, how it's going to look. And that's what we did at the start. You might have noticed, like earlier on in this stream, we spent the time going, oh, what would look cool? What would be the most beautiful API here? And I think we landed on it. I think this idea here is the most beautiful API for what we want to do. We still get access to all the functionality for a batch updater, but now it's nested. And it's only giving us the forms that we actually need for the current record that we're on. So then we went, okay, now we know how to build that. What would be the ideal way to build that inside of the API? And just build out a bunch of pseudocode. Just write code that doesn't work. And for the stuff that's hard, just don't do it. And then you can kind of move things around and figure out what you want to actually build. And now actually building this is going to be easy because I have all of the context. I can start thinking when I'm building this all related forms const, I can have this commented out above it and go, all right, that's what I'm aiming for. This is what I want it to look like. And it's so much easier to write code when you know what you need it to look like. Like, okay, so I need to figure out how to find all the fields for this thing. Okay, I need to figure out, hang on, forms group by ID. Yes, I don't need that anymore. That would just kind of be implied. Yeah. Yeah. So all of this stuff then just falls into place. Creating all of these batch updaters, that's not going to be difficult to do now because I've already written some pseudocode and I go, okay, let's just actually make this work now. And we also had the chance to think through performance. And maybe this is harder for you because you don't have a lot of composition API experience. But once you've done this for a while and you can start thinking, what does it look like in your head when I change this ref, or if I how can I grab this and make sure that I don't lose reactivity? So that's one thing that takes a little bit of knowledge as well. How do I make sure I don't lose reactivity? So, knowing things like that, you can say dot value inside of a computed, but I can't use dot value outside of the computed, otherwise the reactivity gets lost. Little things like that. Um, and yeah, if you can just kind of do things in reverse like this, sometimes I even like to write the documentation first. Um, Write out docs as if you're explaining how this thing is going to be used. And now imagine yourself being somebody who's reading that documentation. If you really couldn't be bothered doing that, you can do it in your head. Go for a walk and think, okay, it's what does it actually what does this actually look like if I'm somebody new who's working with this thing? And I personally think, because I tried really hard at this, I personally think that this is something that people can understand. Use batch updater. Well, that's why I'm getting that error there. Huh. Gotcha. Oh, now I've done something else wrong. What is going on here? Am I like spazzing out? Oh yeah, it needs the extra parentheses. Yeah, like I personally think that it doesn't get much easier than this. Just make me something that does all the work for me, that gives me the common patterns that I do over and over and over again. And the way I figured this out is by writing bad batch updaters many, many times and using them and then going, that sucks, I need a pattern for that. That sucks, I need a pattern for that. Over and over and over again. Until eventually I can build something where I go, like, it took me ages. It might be obvious. Like, you might look at this and go, oh, it's obvious. Just create a way to pull out all the information you need. But like, I was doing all this stuff with meta before, where in order to know if you were updating, you had to do something like this, like batch updater dot meta dot value, and then you would put in the ID of the thing inside of there. And then if you wanted the fields, you'd have to say dot fields dot name dot updating, blah blah blah. And I just looked at that and went, that's not good enough. Like, there has to be a way to do this that's better. And that's where that's where I thought this might be a cool idea. Why don't we just do all of that work for them, creating the shaped form? We still have meta, so I had to do that behind the scenes in order to make things efficient. So you'll see that we've got meta.value, and then we can grab the ID of something. And then on that, you've got all these other things like fields, and then you can say like the name field, and then whether or not that's updating. So I still needed to build this out so that it's possible, and there's a place to keep all of that functionality. And if you want to be able to do things efficiently, you need access to this. But I basically took a bunch of the stuff that I was writing for this code, that was making it simpler, and then put it into the composable. So it's important to start thinking like this. All right, I'm waffling on too much now. So I'm going to get rid of all those examples and bring it back to how it was before. I might even just maybe not get rid of the examples and just comment them out. But I can do that behind the scenes. So hope you enjoyed this stream. I definitely enjoyed making it for you. It ended up being a lot longer than I thought, but we got to do some cool stuff along the way. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. See you in the next one.